So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Professor Keith Fox. He's going to speak, as you can see, about creation and evolution. Keith Fox is Associate Director of the Faraday Institute here. Half-time he's Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Southampton. He used to be head of department there, so I guess this is a holiday job almost compared to that, isn't it? Very eminent scientist in that, and I asked him what he wanted me to tell you, and he said as little as possible, so that's because he's very modest. But you can read a short bio in the papers you've got, not least of which is he's published over 200 scientific papers, which is quite a feat in one career. But without further ado then, let me hand over to Keith Fox.
Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. Thank you for your welcome. I'm conscious that whatever I say this morning, I'm going to tread on somebody's toes. And this is not an easy topic to talk about, but one that I think we need to address. So where am I going this morning? I want to say a little bit about creation itself, about to take a little bit of a step back and ask about some of the origins of life. Evolution, of course, is to do how life has evolved with time, but I want to say a little bit about origins, to ask about evolution, and as a scientist, always to ask the question, what's the evidence on which any hypothesis is based? And then to look at various responses to evolutionary theory that there has been, particularly amongst Christians. My own background is that as a Christian. I hope what I say will be helpful for you if you come from any other faith tradition as well. And then to really raise some issues and some questions. I'm conscious that the next two speakers today, Simon Conway Morris and Dennis Alexander, are going to be the ones who will answer the questions that I raised today. So I'm going to give them a little bit of a hard task. Words get hijacked, and we'll see a few of those as I go through this morning. One of that is the word creationist. All Christians, at least, are in some way creationists. We recite, those of us who say the creeds on a regular basis will say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. And yet that word creationist has become often a dirty word associated with a particular interpretation of how creation has taken place. And in saying that, we mean that creation is distinct from God, it's dependent on God, and it's made from nothing. The question, and where the word starts to get, it's less sure what we mean by it, is actually, in terms of biology, how did that creation actually occur? And before we start to get into any form of discussion or debate, let's also take a step backward and realize that the doctrine of creation actually isn't necessarily just an academic exercise. The doctrine of creation in Scripture is something to inspire us to worship and to inspire us to action. And we need to keep that, I think, in context as maybe we look through some of the mechanisms, is not to lose sight of the wonder of creation, regardless of whatever mechanism you might see and interpret, to give glory to the Creator. So the biblical account is that God is the originator, the sustainer of all creation. It's his handiwork. We observe what he has done, and to use a very theological word, is that it really brings us to a point of awe and wonder where we just say, wow. Now that's not a scientific word, it's not a theological word, but I think that's what it should actually do for us. And keep that in perspective as maybe we look at some difficult issues. In terms of the origin of life itself, Darwin put this within the origin of species, about how we might be able to conceive of some warm little pond, as he put it, with sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, etc., and how creatures could have come from the inanimate, the inorganic and organic molecules, through to very complex species. He had no mechanism for suggesting how that might have occurred. Now we have one or two ideas, but in terms of the origin of life, I would suggest to you that actually we don't have much that's very solid. There's the Miller-Urey experiment, which was done which was to take mixtures of gases that might have been there in a primitive atmosphere around the Earth, things like ammonia and methane and hydrogen and water, and pass electric currents through that to spark it as if it had been in the early Earth environment, and see what happens. And lo and behold, you do get amino acids, you do get complicated organic molecules made. Considerable debate about that experiment, because did those conditions really mimic the right ones that were there on that primitive Earth atmosphere? But you can get quite complex organic molecules, and we see them too in various comets that we know that on their surfaces are organic molecules. We do know too that lipids, that's if you like, what makes the membrane for the outside of our cells, they self-assemble. Just put lipids in a water environment and they form these micelles. It's no good actually having just the constituents of life without having somewhere to keep it. There's the argument of, is it the chicken or the egg that happens? Well, actually, then hen house is quite important as well, the place where you keep those molecules. And we believe that one of the hypotheses as to where these early reactions could have taken place is in hot springs, the deep sea vents at the bottom of oceans that under fantastic pressures, very high temperatures, where you wouldn't expect life to be. And yet we do find very complex organisms living there. And that may account for the fact that even in our biology, we know that metal sulfides are at the center of many important biological enzymes, which is those metal sulfides you'll find in those hot spring environments. I've already suggested the question of, is it chicken or egg? We know that DNA is our genetic material. DNA is used for coding for proteins, and it's proteins that do the functional work in the cell, whether it's the enzymatic reactions, whether it's the structural components. But you need proteins in order to be able to make DNA. So is this a vicious circle? One needs the other one. How do you break into that? For a while, that was kind of an unknown. Now, of course, we believe that there's something called the RNA world. There's actually an intermediary between DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein. And RNA itself is a very fascinating molecule. It's very similar to DNA. Actually only has one grouping different on it, but it has itself its own catalytic activity. And that has many of the functions in enzyme activity. In fact, you can make synthetically in the laboratory by doing experiments with random sequences and picking out what works. You can actually make RNA molecules that self-replicate. So given the right ingredients, RNA makes RNA makes RNA. And we know too that ribosomes, which are the parts of our cells that are responsible for making the proteins, if you like, they decode that message into making the protein. At the heart of a ribosome, the catalytic activity actually is RNA. So maybe that's a bit of our prehistory that's got, if you like, frozen in a very efficient way of making proteins. We need to remember too that the sort of life forms that we see now are very efficient. The enzymes that we have that catalyze those metabolic reactions and all those things within our cells are incredibly efficient. They don't work by magic. They work by very special chemistry where they speed up the rates of enzymatic reactions. Many fold. Billions of fold over what would happen without that. And we're used to very efficient enzymatic reactions. But in the primitive environments, those enzymatic reactions may have been very inefficient. Instead of speeding up something up by maybe 10 to the 8-fold, it might speed a reaction up by, say, only 2-fold, which in our terms is pathetic. But its 2-fold enhancement is better than no enhancement. And over time, 2-fold goes to 4-fold, goes to 8-fold, and so on over long times. Over the past couple of days, I'm conscious that those who've talked about the cosmology and those that talked about the neuroscience have at various times traded big numbers with each other as to how many galaxies there are, etc. So let me trade a few numbers as well. The sheer immensity of the molecular world. So that 1 litre of air, just 1 litre of it, contains about 3 times 10 to the 22 molecules. Think of that. It has been said that the size of that compared to the size of the world that we live in and the total atmosphere is that on average every breath that you take contains 1 molecule of Caesar's last breath. In fact, it contains 1 molecule of everybody's breath that ever has been, because the immensity of the number of molecules just in the inspired air that you would take in. When we look at the number of molecules within cells, so an E. coli cell, bacterium, has a typical volume of about 1 femtoliter. That's 10 to the minus 15 of a litre, very, very small amount. That in itself also has 3 million protein molecules within that. If you take a human cell, that's typical volume of about 2 picoliters. So it's coming up in volume by quite a lot. Even that will have 10 billion, that's 10 with 1 with 10 noughts after that, protein molecules within that. The sheer immensity of the number of molecules that there are within tiny volumes, when we look at the molecular scale of things, is immense. And there are various theories as to how might life in that complexity have arisen from simple compounds. And without going into any of the details, because that would involve some complex chemistry that I struggle to understand, let's actually step back and say for a moment, let's be honest, we have no conclusive theories of that. Here is a quote from a Biologos website. For all we know about the state of the Earth 3 to 4 billion years ago, and what we know about the complexity of the building blocks of life, that's DNA and RNA and proteins, no entirely plausible hypothesis for the spontaneous origin of life has been found. But I'm putting italics there, but this does not mean that supernatural activity is the only possible explanation. Just because we don't understand and we haven't got good enough explanations is not a good enough reason necessary for resorting to say it has to be God did this by a special act. Because whether the origin of life was natural or supernatural, it was of God. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't investigate. Indeed, we should investigate as scientists how this might have happened. But the fact that God might have done something by reproducible bits of chemistry and physics and biology, the transition from non-life to life could be by standard biological, physical, chemical mechanisms. Maybe God created the cosmos in such a way that inanimate chemicals would eventually give rise to life. We looked a little bit over the past couple of days at some astrobiology. Let me just step back a little bit and ask, if we see life on other planets, will that be DNA based? Will it be something similar to DNA? Stephen Benner is a synthetic chemist who calls himself an astrobiologist because he wants to see the nature of that DNA. Can it occur anywhere else? And I rather like these quotes taken from a Nature article that he wrote a few years ago, which says, is DNA the inevitable genetic material? And he says, when you look at it, the first thing you realize it's a very stupid design. Oh. I spend my life working on DNA. It's the molecule that I've worked with. And he talked about negative charges repelling each other. He talks about the whole structure being held together by hydrogen bonds. You needn't worry about those if you don't know what they are, but they're quite weak interactions. And water would, of course, interrupt them. And he says, you're trusting your valuable genetic inheritance to hydrogen bonds in water? If you're a chemist setting out to design this, you wouldn't do it this way. And yet, the more he started to look into the structure of that and to change various parts of it, the more he realized actually there was something very special about that DNA molecule. So as he looks at it, the phosphate's on the outside of it, so it's negatively charged. And we know two negative charges repel each other and go to opposite ends of the universe. It stops the structure collapsing in on itself. The sugars that make part of that backbone, if you change those, almost anything else becomes a structural disaster. The bases that we talk about, those letters, A, G, C, and T, well, they can be changed. In fact, there are people making synthetic genetic codes with other letters as well. It's a molecule that's incredibly stable and yet unstable enough that the strands can be separated so as to be copied. And it's actually mutable, so that you can damage DNA and yet it still is able to work as a biological molecule, and will require that for any evolutionary mechanisms. And it's able to be repaired. It's subject to damage from oxygen, from water, from all sorts of things damage our DNA. RNA gives protein, and it's coded by this genetic code. It's a triplet code where, each three letters code for one amino acid that goes through into a protein. The genetic code is common throughout the whole of biology. That should actually remind us of our humble origins. The genetic code in an E. coli is the same as a genetic code in a human. It does remind us that as of all of nature, from dust we were made. Is that code itself random? Is it just something that got frozen in time that could have... No, we could shuffle this whole lot around and it would still be a code, but it would be a different one. And there are some suggestions that actually this code itself is not random. It's there in such a way that you can change some of the letters in that, in some of the positions, and you still get the same amino acid. Or you get an amino acid that has a very similar structure, very similar sort of properties, so that like amino acids are coded for by like codons. It's also, there is some evidence now that there is interaction between a few of these amino acids and actually that base sequence themselves. So it's a directed form of making that code. So that's enough about, if you like, some of the origins of life, the origins of DNA and the code. We need to now deal with, I think, the real meat of what we're talking about today, evolution itself. Let's get the terms correct as to what is evolution, this whole natural selection. And it's based on the observation that we know, it's common to us, that there are individual variations within populations. You only have to look around the room here and you will see individual variations between people. And that all organisms produce offspring that are related to parents but differ in some ways. And that those characteristics are passed on to the next generation, but there is inevitably some form of a struggle for existence. And those that are best fitted to their environment will survive. Talk about the survival of the fittest, that's actually not quite correct. It's the survival of those who are best fitted to the environment in which they're in. You put me in an Arctic environment and I'm not particularly well suited for surviving in the very cold, but in the sort of temperate environments that we're in. So it's those that are best fitted for surviving in a particular environment in which they are placed. And then we have that descent with modification, gradual change over time. As organisms appear to be designed to fit into their own particular niche, into that particular environment, but actually what it is they've been selected by the pressures of evolution, that those that are best suited for that particular environment survive and replicate and go on to the next generation. And the environment then may change, and of course they're no longer best fitted and best suited to that environment. So descent with modification and selection has shaped the biological world around us. One of the evidences for that over evolutionary time. If you ask the man and woman on the street, my guess is that the answer you'll get is that evolution is based on fossils. Well, yes, but But actually fossils play, I think, a fairly minor part in our current day understanding of what evolution is and the evidence for it. Darwin himself spent a lot of the time on the evolution of origin of species, talking about differences in organisms that he could see, whether that was finches or whether it was selective breeding of doves, looking at anatomical and developmental similarities. But Darwin had no mechanism at all for how these traits, these characteristics, could be passed on and changed, maybe from one generation to the next. He had no mechanism to account for this. And now we do have. He could not have imagined the work that's now going on in genetics and genomics and in understanding the structure and the sequence of DNA. And now we have what's called the neo-Darwinist synthesis, which is putting Darwin's ideas of natural selection together with all our knowledge of genetics and genomics, or the mathematical population genetics that come together as a synthetic mechanism. And people use words like modern synthesis, evolutionary synthesis, neo-Darwinism. Don't worry about the long words. It basically is, we understand how evolution took place on the basis of some molecular details now and the genetics. And I just want to give you a flavour of one or two bits of the molecular origins of evolution. That I could wax lyrical for hours over some of the evidences for that, but let me just give you one or two bits and pieces that I think might be fun. It's interesting, before I come to that, to realise that our genomes are very complicated, and most of our DNA, surprise, does not actually code for proteins. Only about 2% of it actually is involved in making functional molecules of that sort. And a good example of scientific hubris is that when that was first realised, that 98% that doesn't code for proteins was called junk DNA. That meant we don't know what it does, so it must be useless. Never use that phrase, junk DNA, anymore, because we now know that although we don't understand exactly what it does, what function it has, we know that it's important. Whether it's involved in packaging of the DNA to put it within the cell, whether it's involved in various control mechanisms, a large amount of our genomes is actually functional, even though it's not making proteins. But our genomes are records of our genetic past. They're, if you like, within our genomes, are what we might call molecular fossils. They're relics of our evolutionary ancestors. At various times, our genomes have been infected by retroviruses. They're viruses that get incorporated within genomes. An example of a current-day retrovirus that is lethal is HIV. Inserts within the genome and gets copied. Over evolutionary time, many other retroviruses, which are not pathogenic, just hitch a ride and have been incorporated within our genomes. And you can see where of those appeared. And you can construct family trees as to at what point in the genome do those happen and in what organisms are they found. And these can be categorized in a variety of different ways as to whether we call them lines, line L for large, or signs, S for small. And you can see what percentage of our genome these things take up. And when you construct those evolutionary trees based on at what point which organisms have those in which places, you find that it maps beautifully with all the old evolutionary trees based on growth structure. So looking at some of those molecular fossils, let me just pick out a couple of them for you. Our genomes contain a lot of things called pseudogenes. They're genes that don't actually do anything now. We don't need them. They're a relic of what we used to do years ago. Now you're familiar, I'm sure, that you should take your 5 a day, your fruit and your veg, because you need the vitamin C that comes within that. Because you can't make it, it has to be part of your diet. Many organisms make their own vitamin C. And if you hunt within our genome, you can find the relic of a gene that would originally have coded for the enzyme that was able to make that vitamin C. It's there in that degenerate form. We don't need it because actually we probably lived in environments where we'd taken vitamin C in fruit in our diet, and over evolutionary time it's become unnecessary for us. Chimpanzees, hamsters, insects and fish also don't make vitamin C. So we have non-functional copies that are relics of our evolutionary past. And you can do that with lots of other genes as well. Olfactory genes, that's those to do with smell and taste. Lots of other organisms have far better senses of smell than we do, and you can see the relics of some of those genes within our genomes. Let me give you just one other example. We have 23 chromosomes, 2 copies of each, 46. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, have an extra pair of chromosomes. If we arrange them by size, as I've done there, our chromosome 2 seems to correspond to 2 chromosomes in chimpanzees, 2A and 2B. And when we look at the fine details of this, let me give you just a little bit of cell biology and of DNA chemistry. At the ends of our chromosome are things called telomeres, as we know a little bit of Greek, telos. And in the center, imaginatively named, are things called centromeres. And they're very special sequences that define what's a telomere and what's a centromere. And if you look at our chromosome 2, it does have, as you'd expect, those right sequences at the ends and at the center. But you find actually there are 2 regions in that look rather similar to centromere regions. And right in the middle of it is a rather degenerate sequence that looks like it should be at the ends. And it looks very much as though our chromosome 2 has arisen by fusion of 2 other primitive chromosome 2s. So you can still see the relics of this central region. So there's lots and lots of evidence on molecular scale from the genomics and the genetics as to, for evolution. But how have, in particular, Christians responded to this? I rather like this quotation that I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but supposedly the wife of the Bishop of Worcester at the time of Darwin's Origin of Species said, "My dear, let us hope it is not true, but if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known." Let's pass by the whole question. Initially, there was a little bit of hostility to it. I'm not going to go into the history of the acceptance or otherwise of evolutionary theory. But by the end of the 19th century, largely the debate was over, and most church leaders had accepted evolution as the proper scientific explanation for the way in which the complexity of life that we saw it had arisen. Let me give you just a few quotes. So Archbishop Temple talked about evolution touches not on the evidence of design, but the mode in which the design was executed. In one case, the Creator made the animals at once such as they are, and the other, he impressed upon certain particles of matter such inherent powers that in the ordinary course of time living creatures developed. He did not make things, he made them make themselves. So secondary causes. And actually, evolution to some degree was a benefit to theology. Some of the mechanistic views of the way in which life was and the way in which the universe worked rather became deistic in the 18th century. Whereas, as Aubrey Moore put it, Darwinism appeared and in the guise of a foe did the work of a friend. Actually put God back in the picture again, a process of things happening. It wasn't just a mechanistic view of the world. As he put it, for the Christian theologian, the facts of nature are the acts of God. And to put it a different way, our friend and colleague Ard Louis, who's a professor of physics in Oxford, puts it this way. Those of you who are familiar with the child toys Lego, maybe adults play with them as well, but don't admit to it. He thought if I took the Lego blocks and put them together and made you a train, it would be pretty cool. But if I took the Lego blocks and put them in a box and shook the box for a while and I opened it up and they'd spontaneously assembled into a train, even if the train had a few little scratches on it, that might be potentially even cooler. Right? A system that's self-assembled. But how still now do people respond to evolution? And I know that many people find it difficult to come to terms with. And let me just deal with a few very quickly responses. So one is young Earth creation. There's a variety, a different one called old Earth creation, as I'm not going to talk about, intelligent design, and what might be called theistic evolution. Spot the typo. Evolution. People see that as that now it's the source of all evil is the understanding of evolution. So a rejection of evolution, as comes in young Earth creationism. The Genesis account is literally true, and the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. The world might appear to be old, but it isn't actually. What does that say, I would say, about God, who maybe appears to deceive us? The writer Kingsley put it, I cannot believe that God has written on the rocks one enormous and superfluous lie for all mankind. It's saying that what appears to be isn't actually the way that it is. And I have great respect for those who take that view, because they have, I think, a very high view of their interpretation of Scripture. But amongst the scientists, there really is almost no debate. There's debates as to exactly how evolutionary mechanisms worked, but the science says that there's no science that says the Earth is young. All claims are scientifically, and I put that in italics, false. They take a different worldview, such people. If you're like me, you frequently encounter people who will try to pick holes in evolution in the age of the Earth and come up with facts that I can't explain. And I remember being asked, first of all, so if the Earth is that old, why isn't there such a great pile of dust on the moon? Well, I don't know. There is, I found, quite a helpful book called The Counter-Creationist Handbook. I don't like to emphasize the negative. It goes through all of those arguments that are occasionally put through. I like the honesty of this creationist, young Earth creationist, Todd's blog, where he effectively says, come be real. Evolution is not a theory in crisis. And remember, this is somebody who is a young Earth creationist. Is not verging on the verge of collapse. It hasn't failed as a scientific explanation. He just simply says that I just don't accept it. It doesn't fit within my worldview. I take a higher authority from the scientific authority, and I respect that. That is total integrity. It's simply saying that the science points that way, but I'm going to take a different view. Intelligent design is something that's become very, very popular. Again, it's a word that has been, I think, hijacked, because I think all people believing in a divine creator would say that that creator was intelligent. I don't think any of us would want to believe in an unintelligent designer. But nonetheless, it's a phrase that's been associated with a particular view of how evolution might not itself be completely correct. And people like William Dembski and Michael Behe, Philip Johnson, who's a lawyer, talk about this term irreducible complexity, that some things in biology are just too complicated to be explained by evolution. They draw an analogy with a mousetrap, where you need the whole thing in order to function, and any part of it missing and it doesn't function as a mousetrap. It's just too complex. Actually, that's not quite true, because you could take any one part of that and it has another function. You could take the bar across the middle and it's a very good toothpick. You could take the platform and it's a doorstop. And it could be assembled from other parts. And they will often quote very complicated things in biology. Rodney referred the other day to the waggly thing at the end of a bacteria, I think it was, which is technically called a flagellum. And it is a very, very complicated structure. whoops, here we are, the bacterial flagellum, that little bit, you can't really see it here across the end. It is a remarkable structure composed of many, many different proteins. How did it come to be that uses an energy source to make that spin? And I think those who asked that question asked a very real question that forced the biochemists and the molecular biologists to think carefully. How could it have come about? But when you look carefully at it, you find that each of those components has precursor components. And we actually see how it could have assembled over time from other things that had other mechanisms. And here's a paper published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA. Not actually saying this is how it happened, but here's a plausible mechanism for how it could have happened. And you won't be able to read it, but the bottom says these results show that the core components of the bacterial flagellum originated through the successive duplication and modification of a few, or perhaps even a single, precursor gene. So we don't need a divine intervention to make that complicated molecule. Is intelligent design proper science? Well, actually, I think it stifles proper scientific research, because it says that this is what God did. There was a miraculous intervention at that stage, so there's no point in investigating it because there is no mechanism. Steve Jones, a geneticist, describes intelligent design as the logic of ignorance, idleness, and curiosity. I rather like the quote from Charles Coulson, who was professor of chemistry both in Oxford and in London. When we come to the scientifically unknown, he says our correct policy is not to rejoice because we found God. It is to become better scientists. That's what drives me in the laboratory every day, to ask questions, to want to know more about how things happen. And do we actually need a DNA sequencer and an electron microscope and all those bits of high-tech kit to peer down into the cell to be able to have evidence of a designer God? I don't think so. The God that we worship and that inspires a sense of awe and wonder us, you just need to look out there to see the wonders of the world. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, we are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants us to realize his presence not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved. And typically the Bible account points to our knowledge of God in the things that we understand, not in the things that we don't understand. The more we understand, the more amazed we are. There is a sense of awe and wonder and mystery in the world. But it's what we know that drives us to God. Is intelligent design good theology? I think it probably isn't. Because it actually says that God is involved in only certain aspects of the whole created order and not in all of it. It suggests there are some things that are designed and some are non-designed. Whereas Christian theology says that God is involved in the whole process, not just part of it. And click past. The other way of looking at this is what might be called, some people call theistic evolution, others don't like that phrase and call it evolutionary creationism, puts the creation back in the title. And it actually says that evolution is basically the mechanism by which God brought the biological world into the complexity that we have at the moment. It simply says this is the way that God did it. A very influential article was written back in the 1970s by Theodosius Dobzhansky, entitled "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And what is maybe not realized by some people is Dobzhansky was a Russian Orthodox Christian writing. And he writes, it's wrong to hold that creation and evolution are mutually exclusive alternatives. He says, I am a creationist and an evolutionist. Evolution is God or nature's method of creation. And he goes on, does evolutionary doctrine clash with religious faith? It does not. It's a blunder to mistake Holy Scriptures, as he put it, for elementary textbooks on astronomy, geology, or biology. Other theologians have put that differently. John Holt, who I'm not sure I agree with all that he says, but puts it this way: rather than attributing to God a rigid plan for the universe, evolutionary theology preferred to think of God's vision for it. The God of evolution doesn't fix things in advance, nor hoard selfishly the joy of creating. Instead, God shares with all creatures their openness to an indeterminate future. Now, we need to be careful as we look at that sort of way of looking at evolution. Is this just a form of deism? Does it actually say that God just lit the blue touch paper at the Big Bang and everything was then written into the mechanism so that God doesn't need to do anything? I've given up reading blogs of any debates that I do. After reading one of them who described me as a practicing Christian as being a functional atheist on the basis of how he'd misunderstood what I was trying to say. For the Christian, God is there continually upholding his creation. So it's not as though God comes in and tinkers every now and then, but is intimately involved in the whole process. And we need to keep that high in our attention as we look at that. But there are a few objections that people come up to for evolution. Let's look at just a few of those. I'm sorry, it's not supposed to be highlighted in any way. It's only a theory. Of course, a theory to a scientist is at the top of the thought tree. It's not just a hunch I had over breakfast, which is the way maybe that we see theories in common parlance. Hypothesis goes with data to explanation to law to theory. It's right at the top. People say, well, there's gaps in the fossil record. Well, indeed, there are gaps. There might be a gap between dinosaurs and birds, between fish and amphibians. And of course, you look around and you find things that fill the gaps. So there are things that we know about that come in the middle, but oh dear, there's twice as many gaps now. There always will be gaps in that process. How does evolution give new information? That talks about how DNA sequences maybe can be jumbled around, how maybe can be mutated. What about new information? A fascinating enzyme was discovered that degrades nylon. Nylon's a totally synthetic compound. And there's around a factory making nylon was discovered a bacterium with a plasmid in it that coded for an enzyme called nylonase. Well, that's what we call it now, which degrades nylon. And when you look at where did that come from, well, the title of the paper, again published in PNAS, it comes from an alternative reading frame of something that was already there. We just shifted in those reading of 3, shifted it by 1, and then had a few mutations within that. It is possible for new enzymes to emerge. People say, well, we're not descended from monkeys, are we? Well, no, we aren't descended from monkeys. Evolutionary theory says that we and monkeys have a common ancestor. It was about 6 million years ago. Natural selection is a chance process, some people say. We don't like chance. Well, actually, natural selection isn't chance. It's mutations that give rise to those variations. That is a chance process. That's random. But natural selection itself is not random. It's based on the environment in which those mutations are found in. But does that leave room for God if we're talking about random mutations? And people take different views on this. There's one view that says if chance exists in its frailest possible form, God is finished. If chance exists in any size, shape or form, God cannot exist. That's one view that says that random acts can't be used by God. Arthur Peacock, whose name has already been mentioned in other talks, said it's seen as the most efficient and effective way of realizing the potentialities inherent in the nature of the material world. It's as if chance is the search radar of God sweeping through all the possible targets available to its probing. Maybe chance is something that allows us to have free will. Random doesn't actually necessarily mean uncaused or purposeless. It doesn't exclude divine action. I think of some random games that we play. Those of you may be familiar with snakes and ladders, where the rolling of the dice is totally random. Some of you may play Scrabble, where when I lose to my wife, I'm afraid it's a game of chance. Right? It's just what letters you pick up. But the combination of random things with intelligence on top of that is very important. The scriptures talk about God being in control, the lot being cast, and God knows the decision. Humans plan one things, but God establishes their steps. But in other places we see randomness being used by God. So in the killing of the bad king Ahab, it's described in the text as somebody drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel. A random act being used for divine purposes. And from an earthly perspective, many things do seem to happen at random. But the scriptures insist that God still is in control and uses those random acts. After all, the laws of probability, the rules of statistics, still are laws. And overall outcomes can still come through even under a chance process. People say, is evolution wasteful? And all those species that have existed that don't anymore. Well, I'm not going to really address that question, but just to point back to what's already been mentioned in other talks. If we have 10 to 11 stars and in each galaxy, and 10 to 11 galaxies, wow, is that wasteful? Most of which will never be seen by any human. The purpose of the physical creation like that is apparently profligate and wasteful. The questions of suffering and death, which have been highlighted by Richard Dawkins, by Charles Darwin himself, worried about the suffering in the evolutionary process. And I don't really want to go into that, but to say that it doesn't ask any more profound a question. It's been asked for philosophers and theologians for generations about why is there so much suffering in the world? Why do good things happen to bad people? And maybe this just simply sees on a different scale the sort of things that have been evident in all sorts of other ways as well. There is the question too as to, are humans special? Are we just a highly evolved form of biology? And I was going to go into this. I'm running out of time, and I'm going to rely on Dennis Alexander, who I know is going to say a little bit about where humans might have come from evolutionarily later this afternoon. But it turns out that actually we're very, there are other hominids, Neanderthals, Denisovians, who were related to us, and our actual human physiology is rather complicated, rather than the simple linear tree that we've got there. Now, I think my time is up. I've got plenty more that I could say, but I hope I've raised questions as much as give answers, and given you some chance for us to talk together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Keith. And that indeed leaves lots of time for questions. And there is a microphone. Let's start just near the microphone at the back.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm wondering, what would you say to the view that if you were to run the tape of evolution again, you'd end up somewhere entirely different, and all the implications that has for God's foreknowledge and omniscience?
Thank you. And I'm going to, partly I'm going to cheat and say, listen to Simon Conway Morris in the next talk. Certainly, Stephen Jay Gould said that if you run the tape of life again, you get something completely different. My understanding of what Simon Conway Morris says is that that's actually probably not the case. There is an evolutionary landscape, and that some things we see by convergent evolution repeatedly appear. And maybe there's almost an inevitability that over evolutionary time, something that was conscious and sentient and moral in the way that we are would emerge. It may not have our physiology. It might, in a sense, be a highly intelligent dolphin. But that, if you like, is what is almost the inevitability, is that highly complex beings that are rational, that are sentient, that are conscious in the way that we are, would have evolved anyway. There's a whole variety of different views on that, but I think to say that, if you like, there is that inevitability within the creative process that people such as us, with the ability to relate to God our Creator, would emerge. I have a good deal of sympathy for that view. Thank you.
Thank you for that. My metabolism lecturer often said that God went to the pub when he made certain enzymes because they were so inefficient. And I think the biggest example there is rubisco, the protein that plants use to turn carbon dioxide into oxygen and carbon. Do you have any comments on the argument of design, or sort of young Earth creationism arguments, in the light of some of these biological mechanisms that seem so inefficient, and almost like evolution's the best explanation for them?
Yes, I mean, that to my mind is one of the a good argument that says that biology just has happened, and it's made use of whatever happens to be there. It doesn't have to be perfect, it has to be usable. That you could make some arguments about unintelligent design. I mean, that the blind spot in the human eye, the way in which that's innervated, isn't the way in which it would be optimal. Many of the enzymes that we have, now you could, as you rightly pointed out, generate better ones. But it's good enough, and that's what biology often works by. Biology often works in the same way as I work, doing DIY. I've never got the right tool, but I find something that does the job for me in that circumstance. And there's that, I mean, the word is exactation. Biology just takes things and makes them work. And we see lots of ways in which various proteins, enzymes, have been used with small mutations to do something other than what they we think they originally appeared for. So yes, I think if you push it too far, you end up actually with, at some aspects of what appears to be an unintelligent designer, because the world that we see isn't optimal, it isn't as good as it could be. But actually, if the intelligent designer has been using biological processes just to make things that work, that was what you would expect. Does that answer the question? Thank you.
Let's come to the front over here.
Thank you, Keith. Something that's always puzzled me is why human beings are so head and shoulders above any other animal. Is this just a gap in the fossil record, or a gap in evolution, or is there some more spiritual explanation?
Well, we should go on for, I think it's a really, really good question. I mean, there's no doubt in the way in which we see things at the moment that there's a quantitative and qualitative difference between humans and any other species that's there. Homo sapiens has probably been around for 100,000, maybe 200,000 years. That's our best guess at the moment. But that has actually overlapped with other hominids, and there are others that could talk, I'm sure, at greater detail about that. Neanderthals, their genome has been sequenced. We can see how closely related they are to us. In fact, we believe there are bits of Neanderthal genome within ours as well, depending on which part of the globe you originate from. And actually their brains were bigger than ours. We know very little about, if you like, their consciousness, their view of spirituality. And there are those who said actually what sets us apart as humans with that divine spark is actually more a question of what might be called election, a choosing by God. So that we're made in the image of God, not by virtue of our physiology and our genomes, not by virtue of our anatomy, but by virtue of God designated us as being made in his image, in the ways in which other creatures are not. I think Dennis, without wishing to push you on that. I think you might have things to say about that this afternoon. Dennis is nodding gently. Does that help a little bit?
I think there was someone before the end.
Well, two back.
So in the genetic aspect of the talk, if there comes a point in scientific discovery where we're able to reverse or even prevent translocations, duplications concerning disease, how do you think that would affect natural selection, and how, as Christians, should we define the boundaries to genetic modification and repair?
Wow, thank you. And in part, again, without wishing to deflect it, Alexander Massman is going to be talking later on in the week about human genome modification and whether we should do that. My own view on that is that, let me take one step back. Biology evolution just tells us what is. It never tells us about what should be. And that survival of the fittest for the Christian, in terms of the way in which we treat other people, is not a way to live. Right? That we look after those who are weak and vulnerable and poor and disadvantaged, whereas evolutionary theory says, well, let them go to the wall. That's their problem. The species should be the fittest that we can possibly get. So I think there's a whole long tradition, certainly within the Christian tradition and in many other religions too, that says that we actually go against some of those evolutionary mechanisms, and we do look after those who don't have what we might call good genomes. But nonetheless, I think in the whole area of healing and therapy, I think there's a lot to be said for being able to prevent diseases. And if we can, by genetic manipulations, enable people to have more fuller lives as we define them, without in any way prejudicing against those who might also have some form of genetic disability. That it is, again, part of our Christian mandate to be engaged in healing processes. Now, there's a fine line between what's a healing and what's then an enhancement, a therapy and enhancement. I've already hinted, there's a great, I think, burden on us to look after those who are disadvantaged, and not in any way to use genetic information so as to discriminate against people. That we treat people as made in the image of God, irrespective of their physical and mental capacity. Now I'm trying very quickly to skirt around a lot of areas, but maybe we can come back and talk about that later. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. If I can just chip in, I mean, I think this is a great area and an area where Christians ought to be engaging in this ethics debate. I have some friends who work with a small charity for people with genetic disorders. We call them disorders, genetic differences from the norm. And they tell me the story of two blind parents who were having a child, and the doctor said, look, we know what causes the blindness, we can prevent this in your child, or actually I think they'd have to prevent it by aborting the fetus, or before it became a fetus. And the parents said, no, we actually want a blind child, this is our norm, this is what we are. We don't want to interfere with this process to make it different. And I think actually often what we think of as normal maybe is not the only thing that's good. And I alluded to this in my talk, that many scientists are on the Asperger's spectrum, and many artists are too, actually, in various ways. They're sort of outliers from what we think is normal. So if we start cutting away from that, we're going to lose an awful lot of wonderful, innovative, artistic, scientific, and all sorts of other fields of endeavour. So I think it is a really interesting ethical issue to debate, and I think Christians should be in there, actually.
And there is part of what makes us human and special is the ability to show compassion and to care for those, and actually gives us a form of resilience. There's an article, and I think it was on one of the BBC website. If you want to see it, I'll find it on my laptop later. From parents who had a daughter with a form of albinism that meant she had very restricted eyesight. And she had been determined that she was going to be a basketball player, even with that limited eyesight, and the commitment that she'd had to doing that. An interview with the parents who said, if you'd known she was going to be blind or very partially sighted before she was born, would you have had her genetically modified if you could? And the answer was yes. But the question then of, here is the person now, your daughter. Now, granted what you see of her now, would you wish that you had had the genetic modification beforehand? And the answer was no. And actually interviewing the daughter and saying, do you wish that your parents, if they'd had opportunity, could have had you genetically modified? What would you, partially sighted, would you wish they'd done that? She said, no. No, this has made me the person that I am. Right? I'm not as whole as the way in which other people regard normality, but it's actually made me special, has given me, that's made my personality, she put it. And I think it's very moving to read those sorts of stories.
Thank you. We'll come forward for the next two.
Thank you very much. I would, a comment and a question. The comment, you mentioned that every breath we take contains a molecule from Caesar's last breath. This also means we're getting an awful lot of molecules from Christ's breaths and other aspects of
everybody's breath who ever has
of
lived.
his body. Yes, yes, but I mean specifically relating this to the incarnation. You know, one of the things I find absolutely fascinating. Sorry, thanks very much.
Why don't you swap to this one? Hold it a bit closer, maybe.
Sorry, thank you. One of the things I find fascinating is the more we discover about the material world and the interactions within it, the more clearly we can understand the notion of the cosmic meaning of the incarnation in ways that couldn't possibly have been guessed at by the people who originally had an intuition that it has this cosmic meaning. The question is a much more concrete one. Apropos of the genetic code, I think you said there's evidence that this is not random, and I wonder what random means in that context. Could you expand what you're saying there?
Could we design a genetic code that just simply took those codons and shuffled them around? So that UUU, we know it's codes for phenylalanine. Could we change UUU so that maybe it coded for, I don't know, for glycine or a different way? Could we just shuffle it? Is it totally random? And I think the evidence is pointing now that it's not totally random. It itself is, if you like, optimized. It's one of the many billions of possible genetic codes there could be for the way in which we assign different triplets to different amino acids. This is a particularly robust form. It is the only genetic code that's out there in biology, and that's not to say that biology didn't try other ones at various times, but that were seen to be inferior and therefore didn't survive. That's all I was trying to say about this, is that maybe it goes back to the question about, is there an inevitability? If we rewound the tape of life, would it go the same? It is actually, when we look at those molecular details, it's pretty well optimized. It's a very efficient system. Not just efficient, it's robust as well.
I'm one of those people that you alluded to that's uncomfortable with the term theistic evolution. We don't apply that term to other fields like theistic geology or theistic medicine. I wonder, why do we apply it to evolution? And is theistic evolution just evolution?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important point. It is evolution as seen through somebody who believes in the existence of a creator God who is involved in his world. You're quite right, we don't talk about theistic accountants. Maybe we should do. Perhaps it might help us. But in the way in which evolution particularly has been used by the new atheists and by others as an anti-theistic dogma, that's where I think the use of the phrase theistic evolution can be helpful in actually countering the fact that some people suggest that evolution necessarily points away from God and it implies a form of atheism. I don't think anybody actually says that about accountants. Whereas I think there is that assumption in some people's minds that evolution implies atheism, and by putting that tag theistic in front of it. But you're quite right. It is just evolution, but seen through the eye of a belief in a creator God. Thank you.
We'll go right to the back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. So, assuming theistic evolution, suppose we were to have a discussion with Richard Dawkins or someone else, and if he brings up Occam's razor and says, why are you bringing God? You and I agree on the evolution aspect. Why can't we take the God aspect out? How would we answer? Would we say, well, if we are having a conversation on science, on biological science, the two of us, we cannot talk about God? How would you answer?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question, thank you. I would answer in terms of you have to take all the evidence on board. The biology itself, science, I think, is agnostic. I don't think it points one way or the other. You can use arguments of fine-tuning and why is there something rather than nothing. Those are very helpful arguments, but ultimately I think science itself is agnostic. The good scientist, though, has to take all the data on board. A bad scientist is one who says, these bits of data fit within my hypothesis and those don't, so I'm going to ignore them. So where the science may be agnostic, when we take into the whole of life, other aspects of philosophy and our consciousness and all those other arguments for the existence of God, it's taking everything together, not just the biology. So if you just take about the biology itself, then Richard Dawkins, I think, has a point. Occam's razor says we understand chemically how it goes. We don't need a God in order to be able to push things in one direction or another one, so it's an unnecessary addition. But when you take the whole of life together and look at all the evidence across everything, then I think what Richard Dawkins is actually doing is putting one part of that to one side. So I don't want to think about that. I only want to think about this particular evidence that fits within my particular worldview. Does that help?
It does.
Thank you.
Okay, right there. I thought there was somebody other than Rodney.
Yes, just going back to that term theistic evolution again for a moment. Someone like Alvin Plantinga, for example, makes a distinction between guided and unguided evolution, and he sort of says that you have to have guided evolution. Now, what do you make of a term like that?
It's a slippery word as to what does guided really mean. Does it mean that it was all front-loaded in the Big Bang, that it was inevitable it would go this way, a kind of ultra-determinism? Does it mean that a God who's coming in and tinkering? I didn't have time to go into it, but I don't think we see in the scriptures God as being a tinkerer. God is maybe the potter who's moulding. God isn't the engineer who's coming in to tweak the system because it needs tuning. So I really don't quite follow Plantinga, and I think I understand what he's trying to say, and it's trying to come away from the whole idea that things are random and that God has a plan, which as a Christian I would want to affirm. But quite how we see that in terms of a guiding of the process. The inevitability of humans maybe is quite important. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with it, but John Polkinghorne has described the process as being rather like a game of chess against a grandmaster. I can play the moves against a grandmaster that a grandmaster may not be able to predict what I would do because they'd be so hopeless that no proper chess player would ever do them. But the outcome of the process, I'm playing against a grandmaster. The outcome is quite determined. I'm going to lose. I'm going to lose big time. And that maybe is an analogy for the way in which God works with evolutionary processes. If the actual single steps along the way are not of great importance, but the ultimate outcome is important. It's rather the same as in a novel, that the storyline doesn't depend on whether the character has a cup of tea in the middle or whether it's coffee, whether they stop for a 15-minute break or a half-hour break. It's the big picture is quite secure.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about consciousness more. And do you have a view on consciousness's place within evolution? Did God know that, or is that God's ultimate aim, that he was bringing us to the point of being humans and for consciousness to be able to arise? Or was it a random mutation that God is trying to work with, bearing in mind that maybe consciousness is what makes us most distinct from other species, possibly, and enables us to know God at a deeper level, but also to enable us to separate from God on a deeper level, i.e. if you don't have consciousness, presumably all the other creatures do have, they haven't so much an awareness of God.
I mean, I think that's the big question that in biology, in science actually, is what is consciousness? And I don't know whether we come from a religious or an irreligious, maybe that's not the right word, from a non-religious background. I don't think anybody really has the foggiest idea what consciousness really is, except we experience it day to day.
But there are scientists who are trying to work that out.
Oh yes, there are.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not to dismiss that. Was it God's design to bring something that was conscious into being? Well, yes. Whether that has, as I say, had to be anatomically and physiologically exactly the same as us, it's clear that God's design was to have relationships with beings such as us. We also have to say that, taking the Genesis picture, is that the world was described as good a long time before we came on the scene. Right? We've only been around for a tiny fraction of the time that this whole planet, well, the whole universe, has been in existence, and yet that was also described as good. Right? We tend to take a rather anthropocentric view on things, as though the only thing that matters in this universe is us, and all those other things out there are for our benefit. Whereas actually the whole of the created order is to show the glory of God, irrespective of whether there's people there to see it or not. Now there is something very special in us and our relationship with that. But the universe was a very special place long before we came on the scene. So I digressed a little bit from your question, partly because I'm struggling over what consciousness really is.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, so I acknowledge it's a really difficult area to talk about, but I think it's quite important to talk about. So I really appreciate your response. Thank you.
Okay, can we make this the last question? Because one thing that really, really does matter is coffee and tea to Homo sapiens.
When you say when we look at the Genesis picture, I love looking at the Genesis picture, and I think when it says, there it all is, it all belongs to you, go, fill the earth and conquer it. So we are meant to go, we are meant to solve the problems of disease, we are meant to make the world. And is it not possible that, in a way, in that Genesis picture, God is handing us the reins of evolution, humanity, and saying, come on, you know, I believe in you.
Yes, whether I quite want to put that in evolutionary terms, I'm not quite sure, but I agree with what you're saying, is that God, in making us in his image, is actually saying, you're there as my representatives to get on and to do it.
But
do you want to come back on that?
He didn't only make us in his image, he became us.
He
became one of us.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And actually in that becoming one of us actually showed what it should be like to be a human. As one who lives kingdom values and cares for the weak and the poor and the oppressed and does acts of compassion and healing, etc. And showed what it really is as a human being to be on this planet as a responsible person made in the image of God. Now, I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
How are you saying to science, go on, go and figure it all out?
Absolutely.
Figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that's maybe what drives us on a day-to-day basis as scientists. It's fun to figure it out as well. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good note to end on. So thank you again to Keith, and we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. Thank you.